If you're thinking about losing weight, there are a number of issues you need to be aware of. Very important issues that, if you're not aware of them, could lead you down the path not just of regaining the weight you've lost, but also having very serious health problems, even shortening your life, if you don't take these factors into account. Now, that scares a lot of people. Why didn't the marketing for the GLP-1 agonist drug or the bariatric procedure ads tell you these things? Well, it's a sad reality of modern healthcare in the U.S., and that is you're often not told about factors in health unless there's a lot of money to be made. Just think about the statin cholesterol drug industry. $1 trillion have been made by the pharmaceutical giants for this class of drugs that do almost nothing. I know what they claim in marketing, but that's a wild exaggeration. The real tragedy of all that money and attention spent on reducing cholesterol with these statin cholesterol drugs is that it took everyone's attentions away from the real causes of heart disease, of which are readily identifiable and correctable. But you can do it for almost no cost. And so, because there's no money to be made, most of my colleagues, people in healthcare, can't be bothered educating themselves or delivering that information to you. Same thing here. If there's money to be made, let's say a bariatric surgery procedure or a pharmaceutical, they'll tell you all about it. There'll be lots of ads on TV, ads in magazines, lots of talk about it in the media. But what about ways that are safer, more effective? Well, you won't hear about that because there's no money to be made. So I'm telling you this because it bothers me. That really bothers me because I see people who are being misled, taken down the path, and then wondering why their health has gone down the tubes because they followed conventional advice. Now, a lot of this information has become available in the last decade or so, but it's simply not passed on. So let's go over that. So I call this talk Rethinking Weight Loss, the New Paradigm of Body Composition. So what I'm going to try to convince you of is that this old idea of losing weight, just losing weight, is outdated and dangerous, and that instead we want to redistribute fat and muscle around your body, lose fat, of course, from the right places, and that's going to yield, I think, a much better end result in appearance, but also in health, without risk of weight regain that plagues other conventional methods of losing weight. Now, add this idea of losing weight to the long list of widely held beliefs that proved false over long term. So, for instance, it was believed for many decades by doctors and the public that female hysteria could be cured by hysterectomy, removing the uterus. Of course, that's absurd, yet many women were subjected to unneeded hysterectomy because of their emotional issues. My mom went through this, in fact. Another false belief, widely held by doctors and the public, that enemas could cure so many things like fatigue, headaches, and even bad body odor. How about electroshock therapy being offered as a cure for homosexuality? We find that offensive in our age, and wrong, of course, but it was widely believed for decades. How about the fiction of cutting saturated fat and cholesterol to reduce cardiovascular risk and increasing your consumption of healthy whole grains? Well, the truth is that kind of eating causes heart disease, adds to heart disease risk, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. The amylopectin A of wheat and grains, sugars, etc. But know that it's another example of bad information that was widely believed by the public. And yet another one. Reducing calories is a safe and effective way to lose weight. It is a way to lose weight, but it booby traps your health long term and causes problems. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to find solutions, ways to not put yourself into those kinds of situations. Now, there's no doubt, if you were to reduce calories, either by pushing the plate away, smaller portion sizes, your doctor saying move more, eat less, a program you paid a lot of money for, a smartphone app, a meal replacement program, whatever. Or it could be a bariatric procedure that reduces your stomach volume, whether it's lap band or gastric bypass, or a pharmaceutical that reduces your interest in food and slows the passage of food through your stomach, slows digestion. Well, if you do lose weight by any of those methods, there are indeed upfront benefits. The phenomenon of insulin resistance and high blood glucose reverses. That's a good thing. Triglycerides go down. Blood pressure can drop. Total fat in the body can go down. Inflammatory measures like C-reactive protein, interleukin 6, and many others will recede. But I call it a Ponzi scheme. Remember what a Ponzi scheme is? The criminal takes money from one person, invests it for another person, and then keeps on this flow of people to give him money that he puts a lot of it in his own pocket, and then with the appearance that he's investing it for future clients. Of course, it's a Ponzi scheme. There's really no profits. It's somebody putting money in his pocket, taking money from Peter to pay Paul. That's kind of what weight loss, conventional weight loss, does. You're losing weight up front, but paying a huge health price long term. So what are those problems? What's wrong with losing weight by cutting calories? Well, a number of problems. For one thing, we're going to talk about how losing weight by reducing calories, regardless of the method used, is selective for losing subcutaneous fat, fat below the skin, but not the really problematic fat that's called abdominal visceral fat. We'll talk about how conventional weight loss fails to address what's called ectopic fat, fat that accumulates in other places like the kidneys, heart, liver, pancreas, knee and hip joints, and muscle. Because if you don't address that, it will impair your health long term, could even shorten your life. One of the biggest problems, though, is that there's an obligatory loss of muscle when you lose weight by reducing calories. We'll talk about how 25% of the weight you lose is muscle, which is huge. And muscle is the principal factor determining your so-called basal metabolic rate, or BMR. That's the rate at which your body burns calories for the work of life, breathing, digestion, manufacturing proteins. Losing muscle means your BMR drops dramatically and for all practical purposes, permanently. You don't get it back. And when you reduce BMR for years and years after losing weight by reducing calories, it guarantees that you will regain the weight, but not as muscle, but as fat, mostly in the abdomen, the most problematic form of fat, abdominal visceral fat. So we're going to graduate to a smarter way to get all this done by addressing what I call shape and body composition. So let's talk about those different kinds of fat. So there is abdominal visceral fat. That's fat within the abdominal cavity that encircles the intestines, liver, pancreas, and other abdominal organs. And that's the source of insulin resistance and inflammatory mediators. All insulin resistance means is that your other parts of the body, liver, muscle, brain, don't properly respond to insulin, so your pancreas compensates by overproducing huge amounts of insulin. So a person who's insulin sensitive will have a fasting insulin blood level of maybe 2 or 3 microunits per liter. A person who's insulin resistant and their muscle, brain, liver, etc., not responding to insulin, their fasting insulin is going to be 40, 90, 138 microunit. So it's not 10% worse. It's not 20% worse. It's 10-fold worse, 30-fold worse, 100-fold worse. Well, that kind of phenomenon causes expansion of abdominal visceral fat. So it's a vicious cycle, isn't it? The more abdominal visceral fat you have, the more insulin resistance and inflammation you have, that causes the accumulation of more abdominal visceral fat that causes more insulin resistance and inflammation. So you want to stop that cycle. We're going to address insulin resistance and inflammation. So that's in contrast to subcutaneous fat. That's fat just below the skin. It could be in your neck, chest, abdomen, buttocks, thighs, but it's just below the skin. That's a relatively inert form of fat. Doesn't cause insulin resistance, doesn't cause inflammation. It could be a challenge to your weight-bearing joints because it adds to body weight, but it's not a threat to your metabolic health like abdominal visceral fat is. Now, other phenomena associated with an excess of abdominal visceral fat, your cortisol level is increased, which has its own set of complicating factors like acceleration of brain atrophy and cognitive impairment, expansion of abdominal fat. Once again, a vicious cycle. It decreases testosterone in males. It increases estrogen levels in females, which is a risk factor for breast cancer. That increased cortisol, the insulin resistance, inflammation contribute to eroding muscle mass. And the more abdominal fat you have, the more likely you are to develop this parallel problem called myosteatosis. That is, fat deposition in muscle, which is a very serious issue that has very serious consequences for your health. So, fat in muscle is a form of ectopic fat that can occur all throughout the body. So it's in visceral fat, yes, but also in muscle. It can also occur around the heart and accelerate heart disease, in the pancreas and damage your pancreas, in the kidneys and cause kidney disease, in your knees and hips. And you can actually see this on a CT scan or MRI, globules of fat in the joint space that accelerates the degradation of joint cartilage and accelerates the development of bone-on-bone arthritis. So this ectopic fat in muscle, myosteatosis, impairs muscle strength and function, makes it worse. And you can see it. If you scan, let's say, the thigh, you can see it in the bottom image there, how fat in the lighter color, the yellow color, infiltrates muscle, and it impairs your muscle and predicts bad things in your future. So myosteatosis, the more metabolically unhealthy you are, the more fat you accumulate in muscle. You can see that the person on the left has that red is all muscle, lots of muscle, very little abdominal visceral fat. And the person who's less metabolically healthy, in this case a person with prediabetes, less muscle, more fat in the abdomen. And here's a person who's very unhealthy metabolically because they have coronary disease, and these people are almost always pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetics. Look at the muscle, fully and grotesquely infiltrated by fat. And so myosteatosis is a real phenomenon that you can actually see on a CAT scan or an MRI, and it becomes increasingly common as we age, especially in women. So into your 60s and onwards, myosteatosis becomes extremely common. You can see that in older women, it almost becomes universal. So I want to increase your awareness of the importance of the quantity and quality of muscle you have, because it's a principal determinant of your long-term health, your capacity to remain independent and mobile, and how long you live. Here's a study that looked at people who had myosteatosis by CAT scan or MRI versus those who didn't. And you can see that the people who had myosteatosis died sooner than the people without myosteatosis. So this is not just, it is a matter of strength, yes, but it's also a matter of how long you're going to live. You do not want your muscles in your thighs, back, chest, elsewhere. You don't want your muscles infiltrated by fat. And the more abdominal visceral fat you have, the more likely it is that you have myosteatosis, and the more likely it is you die of something related to that myosteatosis. You can see how grotesque this can be. Look at the person on the right. Look at the muscle filled with fat. And so we don't want this to happen to you. Now, when you lose weight by cutting calories, you're specifically targeting subcutaneous fat. You're not targeting the abdominal visceral fat, the more problematic form of fat. And so all those methods, a reduced calorie diet, pharmaceuticals that reduce appetite, a bariatric procedure, all of them involve a reduction in calorie intake and result in preferential loss of the less problematic form of fat and less loss of the truly problematic abdominal visceral fat. This is held true across study after study, that all those methods preferential, you do lose some abdominal visceral fat, but you lose much more subcutaneous fat. I'd like to suggest we're going to flip that, and we're going to purposefully target abdominal visceral fat. The subcutaneous fat will follow. Remember, if the abdominal visceral fat is the driver of insulin resistance and inflammation and myosteatosis, targeting that problem source first accelerates your success in obtaining the shape and body composition you want, accelerates weight loss, yes. So we're going to flip everything on its head and not preferentially target subcutaneous fat, but target abdominal visceral fat and thereby myosteatosis also. Another very, very important phenomenon. There's an obligatory loss of muscle when you lose weight, if you lose weight by reducing calories. So in study after study, about 25% of the weight lost is muscle. So if you lose 40 pounds, 10 pounds will be muscle. Now, the sad thing is, the muscle you lose by cutting calories compounds, makes worse the muscle you're losing just by aging. So all of us lose around 30% of our muscle that we had in our 20s and 30s by the time we get into our 60s and 70s. And that has serious complications, implications. So when you lose weight by reducing calories, you make that much worse. And then other factors enter the picture. Stress, life stress can increase cortisol. And of course, abdominal visceral fat increases cortisol. Insulin resistance accelerates loss of muscle and expansion of abdominal visceral fat. Inflammation, likewise. So the more inflamed you are, the more insulin resistant, more abdominal fat accumulates. The more insulin resistance gets worse, the more inflammation gets worse, the more cortisol gets worse. So it's round and around and around in a vicious cycle. And then, of course, development of ectopic fat and myosteatosis in particular that makes all these things worse and predicts earlier mortality. So we're going to get away from this idea of just losing weight indiscriminately, losing fat from the wrong places, and losing muscle. So we don't want you to be tangled up in this crisis of having lost muscle and then suffering all the consequences long term. Now here's another factor you need to know about. So there are now multiple large databases in which people who've lost weight, almost always by reducing calories in some form, how soon do they die? So look at the orange curve. Those are people who lost 10% or more of their body weight. So a 180-pound woman, for instance, losing 18 pounds. Not uncommon, right? A 240-pound guy who loses 24 pounds. What happens to those people? They're much more likely to die. In fact, their mortality rate is more than double the people who lost less weight or didn't lose weight at all. This is based on very large databases. In aggregate, about 50 to 60,000 people follow for up to 10 to 20 years. And this is held true across study after study. People who lose weight by reducing calories die younger. And the more weight you lose, the more likely this holds true. Now, people say, my colleagues say, well, don't worry. We're going to have people engage in a vigorous exercise program that involves resistance exercise. And it's going to mitigate or avoid all those problems like losing muscle and reducing basal metabolic rate. Is that true? Well, here's a very informative NIH study where people who are very obese, BMIs over 50, body mass indexes over 50, and they were put on a strict low-calorie diet and an extraordinary 2 hours a day, 6 days a week program of resistance training and aerobic exercise. So an extraordinary commitment. This occurred over about 7 or so months. They did lose a lot of weight, of which 23 pounds was muscle. Recall that there's a 25% loss of muscle when you lose weight. In this case, because of the intensive exercise program, they only lost 17%, but still enough to impair health. So even an extraordinary extreme dedication of 2 hours a day, 6 days a week did not prevent muscle loss. It just mitigated it somewhat. And they still had a dramatic reduction in basal metabolic rate, meaning even if they maintain a low-calorie intake and an intensive exercise program, they will regain the weight as fat. Here's another very informative study from the NIH called the Biggest Loser Study, based on people who were graduates of the 8th season of that TV show, Biggest Loser. And so you recall these people engaged in many hours per day of exercise, strict low-calorie diet. It was so awful. These people often broke down, hysterics, crying, right? But they did. They did lose weight, and their basal metabolic rate dropped by 27%. Now, the study only went for 6 years after graduating from the program, and the BMR persisted low for that 6 years. So it's, for all practical purposes, the reduction in basal metabolic rate, the rate at which you burn calories, is reduced for a long time, perhaps permanently. That means because your body thought you were starving. It doesn't know you're on a TV show or you're a modern person with a smartphone, nice car, and nice house. It thinks you're starving. Your body thinks you're starving when you reduce calorie intake. So your body compensates to keep you alive by reducing your calorie burn rate so you don't die of starvation. But that's essentially a permanent effect. What that means is even if you maintain a low-calorie diet and an intensive exercise program, you will regain the weight and you'll regain the fat. You regain very little muscle. Regaining muscle is tough. Here's an example of Danny Cahill, very nice guy, who had extraordinary commitment on the TV show, 8th season. He lost 239 pounds over 7 months. Think about that. That is extraordinary. You know, people often say people become obese because they're lazy and slothful and indulgent. Well, here's a guy who lived on 800 calories per day, which is misery, by the way, and many hours, up to 6 hours per day, resistance training and aerobic exercise. He lost an extraordinary 239 pounds. By the way, he and other people, when they look terrific on the surface, they're all wearing Spanx underneath to conceal their huge skin flaps from the deflation process. So he wins the 8th season. He gets the $250,000 prize. He leaves the show. He told me that he maintained a low-calorie diet and an intensive 6 days per week, 2 hours per day exercise program, and he regained all the weight. He said he'd go back to the annual reunions that the producers of the TV show hosted, and he saw all the other graduates of the program regaining all their weight because their BMR dropped. So it wasn't measured officially, but I calculated that if we assume that with his extreme exercise program and calorie reduction, that he only lost 17% of muscle as compared to 25% of the expected otherwise. That means over 40 pounds of muscle was lost. That means his BMR was reduced. So sadly, as nice a guy and as hard as he worked, he was given bad information that guaranteed that his BMR would drop, and it set the stage for guaranteed weight regain as fat, not as muscle, after he left the show. So, conventional methods to lose weight by cutting calories guarantees loss of muscle and long-term weight regain because of the reduction in BMR. So think about this. So we have a woman. She loses weight, let's say 40 pounds, because she reduced her calorie intake, or she took one of those injectable or oral GLP-1 agonist drugs, or she even had a lap band or gastric bypass procedure for a lot of money, right? And risk. Well, she lost 25% of her muscle mass, maybe a little less if she incorporated extreme resistance exercise. Her basal metabolic rate has dropped, typically 25 to 29%. She maintains a low-calorie diet and an intensive exercise program, yet she regains all the weight as fat, mostly in the abdomen. Her level of insulin resistance and inflammation and myosteatosis and ectopic fat is now worse than it was before she started to lose weight. So in other words, the conventional notion of losing weight is a trap. It entraps you, or a Ponzi scheme, as I like to say. We know this is a fact. Here's a study from the UK for semaglutide. So people took semaglutide, injectable, and they lost a lot of weight. You can see that curve. That curves down. They lost a lot of weight. they stopped the drug after 18 months, you can see they regained most, not all, but most of the weight. And the weight they regained is nearly all fat, very little muscle. It's very difficult to regain muscle. And their level, the severity of phenomena like insulin resistance, number of people who are pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic, blood pressure, triglycerides, fatty liver, cardiovascular risk for cognitive impairment and dementia, risk for breast cancer, is now worse after weight regain than it was at the start. Yet these people may have paid a lot of money. And when you lose muscle like that, it means long term, you're at much greater risk for frailty, falls, fractures, loss of independence, and now you know, earlier death. So what if we could be smarter? What if we could preferentially target abdominal visceral fat while preserving or even increasing muscle? Well, presumably, you'd have greater health benefits, right? On factors like blood glucose, insulin resistance, inflammation. Weight loss would be faster because you're targeting the source of that vicious cycle, right? Of weight gain, abdominal fat, insulin resistance, inflammation. We're going to preserve BMR and thereby prevent long-term weight regain. And we avoid factors like disability, falls, fracture, frailty, that comes about because of the loss of muscle. So we're going to try to work around all those problems by taking a very different approach. So the first step is to get rid of all these ideas that you've been told about cutting calories, move more, eat less, smaller portions, all the things you've been told, they're all wrong. They work in the near term, they booby trap your long-term health. So we never reduce calories. We don't rely on pharmaceuticals or bariatric procedures to reduce calorie intake. It is not necessary to engage in these extreme exercise programs. Exercise is great for you, but you don't have to engage in an extreme program, 2 hours a day, 6 days a week to prevent weight regain, because it doesn't work, right? Some exercise is going to be helpful, but you don't have to engage in the extremes that these people in these studies and in the TV show did. We're going to achieve all this by restoring microbes in the gastrointestinal tract that virtually everybody has lost because of their susceptibility to common antibiotics and other factors. We also combine factors that are lost from the modern life experience that help those microbes get their job done in reshaping your body. Now, when we talk about microbes in the gastrointestinal tract and other locales in the body, we have to recognize that microbes are very heterogeneous. They're very different kinds of microbes. So here's an example, though, of someone who took an antibiotic for 5 days. And on the left, you can see that 1,000 I highlighted. That's the number of species, essentially, that someone lost. Over 1,000 species lost in their gastrointestinal microbiome by taking an antibiotic for 5 days. Well, many of those species were important for human health. Not all are, but many were. And so just one exposure to an antibiotic has devastating effects on the microbiome. And we've lost many beneficial microbes that did good things for you, including reducing abdominal visceral fat, reducing inflammation, reducing insulin resistance, preserving muscle. So we lose, for instance, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. We lose Akkermansia. We lose various bifidobacteria species. We lose lactobacillus species like Crispatus. It's very important for female health, by the way. We lose other species like Ruminococcus and Bacteroides, and one of the most important of all, Lactobacillus rhodori. So these are microbes lost because of our overexposure to antibiotics. So this is the experience of one antibiotic. Most people by age 40 have taken 30 courses of antibiotics. 650,000 prescriptions are written every day for antibiotics. For every 1,000 children, over 1,300 prescriptions are written every year. So we are wildly overexposed to antibiotics, some of which are necessary at times, many of which are not. And among the effects is massive disruption of the gastrointestinal microbiome in ways that ensure weight gain mostly in the abdomen, and loss of muscle. So we want to focus on this idea of muscle. We're going to work to preserve or even increase muscle and never allow muscle to degrade. We're aging, right? We're losing muscle. We're going to try to counteract that. And we're certainly not going to lose muscle by reducing calories. So this is the theme of my new book, Super Body, where a lot of this is detailed, including all the recipes for how to make these microbes. Bottom line here, we never lose weight by reducing calories. We're going to address small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, S-I-B-O, and the endotoxemia. That's a major driver of weight gain in the abdomen and loss of muscle and myosteatosis. In other words, the 1,000 species or so you've lost in your gastrointestinal, we're going to try to rebuild them and bring back all those beneficial microbes. And we're going to push back the invasion of fecal microbial species that have ascended from the colon into the 24 feet of small intestine. Recall that the small intestine is very permeable because that's where we absorb nutrients like amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals. And if fecal microbes have come to invade, colonize the small intestine, they live and die. They have very short lives measured in hours. When they die, they shed their toxic compounds like endotoxin into the bloodstream. That's endotoxemia. That's a major driver of loss of muscle and expansion of abdominal visceral fat, as well as higher blood glucose, insulin resistance, body-wide inflammation, as well as many other phenomena, depression, suicidal thoughts, anxiety, skin rashes like rosacea or psoriasis, neurodegenerative. So in other words, you're going to be given a program that facilitates targeting loss of abdominal visceral fat, preservation or increase in muscle, but provides a whole landscape of other health benefits. And we're going to try to work to restore microbes that have effects like boosting the hormone oxytocin and reducing cortisol to compound some of these benefits. We're going to restore nutrients, also help restore muscle and have other beneficial effects like vitamin D. We're going to restore factors lost from the modern diet because of silly advice to cut your saturated fat and cholesterol that cause people to abandon consumption of organ meats like heart and stomach and brain and skin and others that were rich in collagen and hyaluronic acid, two factors that have major roles in your shape and body composition. Where fat is located, how much fat you have, and how much muscle you have. Collagen does it directly, hyaluronic acid does it indirectly, but they're both major players. Ladies will tell me, don't tell me about hyaluronic acid. They say, I apply it to my eyes every day. Well, what did that do for the skin on your abdomen or your neck? Nothing, of course. So we're talking about oral consumption of hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is one of the rare fibers that comes from animals. And it has the peculiar capacity, the wonderful capacity, to bloom a lot of those species I mentioned, the Faecalibacterium, Akkermansia, Ruminicaceae, that provide numerous benefits to your efforts to reduce fat in the right places and preserve or increase muscle. So, if you want to know more, please follow my other YouTube videos, see my thousands of blog posts, WilliamDavisMD.com, see my membership website, which is innercircle.drdavisinfinitehealth.com. See my Super Body book, my Super Gut book. This is all laid out. Where to source these microbes, how to cultivate them to very high counts to magnify the benefits you obtain, how to use diet, how to use supplements like collagen to rebuild muscle, reduce abdominal fat, so that you're not exposed to all the dangers of conventional weight loss.